Now, the fall of the Berlin Wall 20 years ago was felt on the African continent, which for decades had been one of the areas for the conflict between East and West. And now joining me with more on the repercussions is VOA Scott Bobb in Johannesburg. Scott, you did a wonderful radio piece that I listened to earlier where you were explaining the far-reaching effects of this breakdown of the Berlin Wall on the continent. Just in a nutshell, how would you put it?
Well, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War that followed the fall of the Berlin Wall had profound changes because up until then, Africa had been one of the arenas for the conflict between East and West. The ideological struggle for influence in Africa had brought political assassinations and military coups. It had contributed to the authoritarianism and political instability that characterized many of African countries' early years of independence. So this ended, and what you saw was some of the Moscow-supported dictatorships, such as in Ethiopia, declined and fell, and then in other countries there was marked move toward a multi-party democracy, and we saw over the subsequent years many countries holding elections with many parties, whereas before they had been one-party states.
Now, the direct impact of this collapse of the Berlin Wall on Africa specifically, you had the East providing arms to fund liberation struggles in some countries, and then you had the West literally investing in parts. So obviously there was a conflict among African leaders really in terms of how to accept this reunification of Germany.
Yes, in particular in southern Africa, East Germany had been a major provider of arms and military training to liberation movements there, and West Germany had major investments, and so many of the liberation leaders were a bit apprehensive when they saw that East and West Germany were beginning to make moves toward reunifications, afraid that they would lose support. In fact, eventually, the collapse of the Cold War led to greater efforts on all sides to end apartheid, to end the wars in Angola, Namibia, and Mozambique.
And, Scott, you pointed out some of the positive attributes or aspects of the breakdown of the Berlin Wall, but there were also some negatives. Some analysts even attribute a lot of the inequalities, not only around the world, but specifically in Africa, to this breakdown or to the fall or collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, etc.
That's correct. For example, the collapse of communism and the end of centralized economic planning brought new forms of capitalism. These forms helped create wealth, but a lot of that wealth went to elites in Africa and their business partners in the West, people who were better prepared to take advantage of these opportunities. And then even though people were celebrating economic freedom and political freedom, there was a breakdown of old certainties, the fact that people could no longer rely on the state to provide a sort of social welfare net, even though it might be very basic. Also, within society, there was a conflict between tradition and modernity. The extended family lost some of its influence, and there was a rise of a nuclear family, different social mores and ethics and so forth. So these are far-reaching repercussions that really we probably still don't realize the full extent of.
Well, thank you so much for putting all that into context for us, Scott Bobb.